Welcome. In today's episode, we will be continuing our discussion of ancient Greek philosophy, and we will attempt to conclude our study of the ancient Greeks before moving on to ancient Rome. Last time, we talked about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And to conclude our discussion of ancient Greek philosophy, I want to turn to the concept that will be with us in the rest of our semester of study, as we consider the concept of truth with a capital T, eternal truth, versus the German phrase Zeitgeist, meaning the spirit, the Geist of the world, the way the world sees things. And this is an interesting point throughout the rest of philosophy that sort of loosely was still understood in the age of the ancient Greeks, and these are ways that we will look at world history and philosophy throughout the rest of the term. The zeitgeist, the spirit of the world. This is how the world sees things. There's not a search. When you're searching for the zeitgeist, you're not looking for whether or not something is true. You're looking for, is it relevant? Is it how others see things? It's a very much of a focus on how does the world see and understand things versus this idea of transcendental or eternal truth. And a common way that future philosophers, very famously Thomas Aquinas, in his interaction with the philosophy of Aristotle and the transcendental truths, is the idea that all human beings demonstrate an understanding of and a longing for perfect truth, the true, that we like truth and we dislike falsity, that we seek for love and that we believe that it exists and that we deserve it. We seek justice. We like justice and fairness, and we don't like when we and others don't have it. We seek for the beautiful, and we appreciate many beautiful things all in common. And state of being or existence or our place in the world, that we all instinctively seek this and understand it, and that there are eternal truths that point to God and point to philosophy as a major starting point. And anyway, these are just all concepts that throughout history and Western thought, you can trace some of these concepts to debates that Aristotle and Plato and others had. The term philosopher means lover of wisdom, one who loves wisdom and seeks truth. And so these are concepts the ancient Greeks have brought to their philosophy, and that we still look back to them today as we try to understand, again, how and why the world is the way it is. How do the ancient Greeks inspire other aspects of history that stand out? Next one is in education. We already mentioned the Socratic method. This is something that is still with us anytime you've been interrogated, not by the police, but by a teacher, as a way to draw out understanding and maybe realize flaws in our own argument or to understand something at a deeper level. This is something that we gain from the ancient Greeks and the philosopher Socrates in particular, called the Socratic method of asking questions and sort of almost interrogating someone in order to get to a deeper understanding of something. Another major ancient Greek tradition is the School of Athens. And this is let's see, I think I have a picture here later during the Renaissance. This is a Renaissance artist rendering of the School of Athens, sort of this idyllic place where people would congregate not because they had to go to school, but because they were philosophers, lovers of wisdom, lovers of knowledge, and that people would pose questions and give lectures and have debates and discussions simply out of a love of knowledge. And while the real School of Athens was never probably quite as idyllic and romantic as that idea makes it sound, and this image makes it seem so exciting and thrilling, it is an idea that has captured the Western imagination as being an ideal that may be worth striving for. All right. Another concept in education that really lends its way to politics and governance is the idea of Demokratos. Uh, Demokritos was an ancient Greek philosopher, scientist, who conceived of the idea that all the building blocks of humanity were made up of atomos, or these small, indestructible building blocks, because the prevailing thought was that all matter was made up of four elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. And that gravity was not a chief principle of the universe, but rather the principle governing the universe is the phrase like goes to like, that like items go toward each other, that fire wants to be toward fire, and water, when it rains, it wants to go to the sea towards other water, and if you throw a rock up in the air, it wants to go towards other rock or the earth, and so it falls down to the ground. And there are all these kind of examples that sort of prove that way of thinking. Demokritos, on the other hand, in the theory of the atomos, is the idea that actually everything is made up of these atomos, or atoms, and that's where we get the phrase for our atomic theory of the universe, and our understanding of atoms that make up the building blocks of all matter in the universe. Even more interestingly, the man's name, Demokritos, and his theory of the atoms is where we get the concept of democracy, that idea of a form of government, not of a monarch or mono, a single ruler, but of the small constituent parts of a society, the atomos, the us, the individual citizens that make up a democratic system of government. And so even that is something that still we look to today to understand our form of government, a democracy, a republic. We could look at all sorts of Greek art, and to any type of introduction towards art would require some pictures. The Parthenon in Athens is a famous Greek temple on the Acropolis, at the highest spot in Athens, showing off their use of mathematics and proportionality in their construction. Famously, they used their columns to support their structures. We saw a lot. They did paint, but a lot of the paintings don't survive. A lot of sculpture. They were famous for freestanding sculpture and busts, or sort of headshots of sculpture. The Greeks were extraordinarily gifted in the arts, and in fact, there are many of their techniques, particularly working with marble, that humans today still struggle to achieve, even with the aid of modern machines and computers, that the Greeks were particularly skilled at. The ancient Greek writer Herodotus is named by many as the father of history, as the first sort of modern, slightly objective historian who recorded things in a way that we would recognize as being modern history. The ancient Greeks are almost so famous for poetry. And again, too many to go into, but a couple just to hit the highlights. One of the most famous was a blind storyteller named Homer. And they don't believe that Homer, he's like Oprah or Madonna, we only have one name for Homer, that he didn't make up these stories, and he never wrote them down, but he was famous for his telling of them, of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are both connected to both the Greek pantheon of gods and to the Trojan War, which we'll get to in just a little bit. Also very famous is the writer Sophocles, most famous perhaps for his works called the Theban Plays. And from the Theban Plays, we get one of our most interesting characters in literature named King Oedipus. King Oedipus suffered a terrible fate because in Sophocles' telling about King Oedipus, his parents received a fortune that this son of theirs, Oedipus, would grow up to kill his father and marry his own mother, which is a horrid fate, and so they intended to kill the child, and they thought they did. But he ends up, through a series of unfortunate events, being adopted by a different king and queen. And when Oedipus, in his older age, receives this same fortune, that he would one day murder his own father and marry his mother. He himself chooses to leave his home, but he is leaving behind his adopted family. And in his journeys, he actually comes into a conflict with a man on a horse and kills him, who turns out to be the king of a foreign land. And through a series of events, he takes that man's widow as his wife. But by the end, it is revealed to all that he has, in fact, killed his own father and married his mother. And it's a terrible, terrible Greek tragedy, but it gives rise to that famous phrase from Sigmund Freud's psychology, that of the Oedipus complex, that Freud in the 19th century gave rise to that notion that is some deep-seated psychological desire that many people have, is to somehow deep down in a sick way enact the so-called Oedipus complex and do those sorts of things. But that's a famous Greek tragedy that still with us today, the Oedipus trilogy of books. And the final play in that work is called Antigone, which is actually about, I believe, the daughter of King Oedipus named Antigone, and the main theme of this play is one that is still very relevant. It's a play about God's law, man's law, or higher law, lower law, and the idea that the law forbids the burying of her brother, who has been killed in battle in rebellion against the king. And because he's a rebel and a traitor, they forbid the burying of his body. But that is a disgrace, and that's considered a higher law, God's law, a law of just justice and humanity. And so it's a famous early Greek play that sorts out that very human tension between a higher moral law and a lower man-made law that maybe outlaws something that is very important or very moral to people such as Antigone. Our final topic is we'll talk about some very famous Greek wars and contribution to war and battle. Some famous concepts from Greek history include the hoplite, or the individual soldier. The group of Greek soldiers made up what was called the phalanx, or a giant troop of soldiers with their long pikes and shields who'd march in lockstep, and for a long period of history was very dominant on the battlefield and a fearsome sight to behold indeed, until it was supplanted by the Roman legion. We'll talk, you may have studied in the past about the Peloponnesian Wars on the Greek peninsula. These are a series of wars among the city-states, very famous, between the very warlike Spartans and the more scholarly and democratic Athenians. But war among the Greek city-states were called the Peloponnesian Wars, that you may be familiar with. You might also be familiar with the Persian Wars and the Battle of Marathon, for which the modern-day Marathon is named. You had a battle that the Athenians won over the Persians at Marathon, and old Phidippides, as he's usually known as, ran, whether a couple different possible routes, ran the 26.2 miles from Marathon to the city of Athens to tell them that the battle was already won and they should not surrender to the Persians. And of course he did it, and the message was received, and the Athenians held firm, and they won the war against the Persians. And then old Phidippides died, which, kudos to those who are marathon runners. More power to you. I do not see how we have a modern event today where the first guy who ever did it ran that far and then died. And so other people saw Phidippides do that and did it in his honor. And that's how we have the modern idea and concept of the marathon, and why it's 26.2 miles and why it even is called a marathon. And it comes from this battle of the Greeks, the Athenians, over the Persians. Next time we'll pick up with perhaps the most famous of the ancient Greek wars, the Trojan War, even though much of it has to do with myth, but it also has to do with Homer and his Iliad and the Odyssey. And we will finally conclude our study of the ancient Greeks in order to move on to ancient Rome. Thanks for watching.